Not every old car from America was a rust bucket or a breakdown waiting to happen. Some models earned reputations as indestructible machines, built with rugged frames, simple mechanicals, and engines that could take abuse for decades. These cars weren't just daily drivers, they were legends of durability, trusted by families, taxi companies, and police fleets alike. Here are 10 old American cars that were truly built to last forever.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. At first glance, the Ford Deluxe might not look like anything particularly exotic compared to the flashy Cadillacs or Packards of the era, but what made it remarkable was durability and accessibility. It was the car for ordinary Americans who needed something reliable in a time of economic recovery from the Great Depression and just before the hardships of World War II. One of its strongest points was the engine lineup, most notably Ford's now legendary flathead V8. By the late 1930s, Ford had refined this engine into a workhorse. It wasn't the most powerful on the road, typically producing around 85 horsepower in the Deluxe, but it was smooth, simple, and very dependable. The flathead V8 became famous for its ability to run and run, often outlasting the very sheet metal wrapped around it. Mechanics loved it because it was easy to work on and parts were widely available. This engine gave the Deluxe a reputation as a car that could survive neglect, bad roads, and tough weather, all while still getting its owner where they needed to go. The body design of the Deluxe also reflected Ford's practicality. The 1937 redesign in particular introduced a more modern, streamlined look with integrated fenders and a sloping grille. It wasn't just styling. The aerodynamics slightly improved efficiency and helped keep the car looking up to date at a time when appearance was beginning to matter more in the automotive world. Yet beneath the sheet metal, the chassis and suspension remained rugged and straightforward, perfectly suited to America's often unpaved or poorly maintained roads. Owners discovered that the Deluxe could handle years of wear and tear. Even after the body began to rust, which was quite common as pre-war steel had its weaknesses against corrosion, the flathead V8 kept on ticking. Many of these cars, stripped of their elegance, ended up as work vehicles on farms, in small towns, or converted for wartime service. During the early 1940s, when civilian car production halted, Deluxes were pressed into military and government roles because of their toughness. The cultural importance of the Ford Deluxe shouldn't be overlooked either. For many American families, it represented their first step into modern motoring with a V8 engine. It wasn't just transportation, it was freedom, a machine that could carry a family across states, through rural backroads, or down bustling city streets. In the collector car world today, surviving Deluxes are treasured not just for their looks, but for what they represent. Ford's philosophy of building affordable cars that lasted. Some restorers say that if you can get a flathead V8 Deluxe running, it will probably keep running far longer than you expect. So, when we think of the 1937 to 1940 Ford Deluxe, we're really thinking about a car that combines simplicity, reliability, and accessibility. It might not have had the glamour of luxury makes, but it became an enduring symbol of practical American engineering. Quite literally, in many cases, the bodies rusted away while the engines kept going, a testament to its mechanical longevity.
Number 9. When we think of post-war America, we think of prosperity, expanding suburbs, and a booming car culture. Few vehicles represent that transitional era better than the Chevrolet Styleline, produced between 1949 and 1952. At first glance, it was just a modest family sedan, coupe, or wagon. But under its skin was one of the most durable drivetrains ever to come out of Detroit. One so robust that mechanics used to joke, "These cars will outlast the roads they drive on." 1. Background: Chevrolet's post-war strategy. The late 1940s brought a huge demand for cars. After World War II, manufacturers had been restricted from making civilian automobiles, so when production resumed in 1946, buyers rushed to dealerships. Chevrolet needed something solid, affordable, and dependable for the working class. That's where the Styleline came in. It was practical, straightforward, and built with durability in mind rather than flashy gimmicks. It wasn't a luxury car, nor was it a performance machine. Instead, it was designed to be the reliable bread-and-butter car for American families. 2. The heart of the beast, the Stove-Bolt 6. The key to the Styleline's toughness was its engine, the 216 cubic inch inline 6, commonly called the Stove-Bolt 6. First introduced in the 1930s, this engine had already proven itself as one of the simplest and most rugged power plants ever built. It used a cast iron block, splash lubrication, and a low compression design. These traits made it underpowered compared to V8s, but they also meant the engine could survive neglect, poor fuel, and even minimal maintenance. This was an engine you could run hard, overheat, or drive on low oil, and it would often keep running. Farmers, small-town families, and delivery drivers loved it for exactly that reason. 3. Simplicity in design. Durability often comes from simplicity, and the Styleline embodied this principle. Its drivetrain had fewer complicated parts that could break down. The manual 3-speed transmission, often called the 3 on the tree, was nearly indestructible. Mechanics in rural areas adored the car because it was easy to service and didn't require specialized tools. This meant that even in small towns with limited resources, the Styleline could be kept alive for decades. 4. Rust versus reliability. Interestingly, while the body panels of the Styleline were prone to rusting, especially in northern states where road salt was common, the engines and drivetrains just refused to die. Owners often joked that the body will fall apart before the engine quits, and in many cases, that turned out to be true. In fact, it wasn't unusual to see Stylelines running well into the 1960s and 70s with their original engines, long after most cars of their era had been scrapped. 5. Cultural impact. The Styleline wasn't glamorous, but it became a backbone of American mobility. Families used them for daily commuting. Farmers put them to work on rough rural roads. Young hot rodders in the 1950s and 60s often used the Styleline as their first project car, modifying them for racing. Because they were so cheap and plentiful, the Styleline was a car that ordinary Americans could depend on and identify with. 6. Legacy. Today, the Chevrolet Styleline holds an important place in automotive history. It wasn't flashy, but it was a survivor's car. It proved that dependability and toughness mattered just as much as horsepower or luxury. Many restored examples still exist, but what's truly remarkable is how many were simply used until they were too rusted to hold together, not because the engine or drivetrain had failed, but because the steel had given up first. Closing thought. In an age when cars are often criticized for being overcomplicated and short-lived, the Chevrolet Styleline stands as a reminder of a different philosophy. It was built for real people, real roads, and real conditions. And because of that, it earned its reputation as the car that could outlast the roads themselves.
Number 8. The Ranchero is often remembered as the first American car-truck hybrid. While Australia had been building utes, utility coupes, since the 1930s, Ford brought the idea to the U.S. market in 1957. The concept was simple. Take a sedan platform, cut out the back seat, and replace it with a pickup bed. The result was a vehicle that offered the comfort and handling of a car, but with the practicality of a small truck. Now, what made the Ranchero durable was not its novelty but its engineering roots. Unlike many experimental vehicles that ended up as fragile oddities, the Ranchero was based on proven Ford sedan platforms. The early models borrowed from the full-size Ford Fairlane, which gave them sturdy frames and drivetrain options ranging from reliable inline 6s to the small-block Ford V8s. By the 1960s, the Ranchero downsized to the Falcon and Fairlane underpinnings. Then, in the 1970s, shared its DNA with the Torino and later the LTD2. In other words, the Ranchero was always built on something Ford was already producing in large numbers. This shared engineering had a huge benefit. Parts were plentiful, mechanics knew how to work on them, and the engines were tried and true. The inline 6 engines in particular were almost legendary for their ability to take abuse. Many Rancheros used in farming, light construction, or delivery service racked up well over 200,000 miles with nothing more than regular oil changes and the occasional tune-up. And if buyers opted for a V8, they got one of Ford's long-lived small blocks, which were already famous for powering everything from family sedans to Mustangs. Another reason the Ranchero lasted was its versatility. It could haul loads that a regular car couldn't, yet it was easier to drive and park than a full-size pickup. For small business owners, farmers, and tradesmen who didn't need a heavy-duty truck, the Ranchero was the perfect middle ground. Its car-like comfort also made it popular with families who wanted a second vehicle that could double as a workhorse. Over its 22-year run, the Ranchero adapted to the changing automotive world. The 1957 to 1959 models had that flamboyant, finned styling of the era. The early 1960s saw compact, economical Rancheros on Falcon platforms, which became popular during the first wave of small car demand. By the 1970s, the Ranchero grew larger and more luxurious, reflecting the American trend toward big, comfortable vehicles. Yet, even as it evolved in size and style, the core formula remained: sedan engineering paired with a pickup bed. Durability wasn't just mechanical either. Many Rancheros physically survived into the modern era because they were valued and cared for. Farmers, small business operators, and collectors alike recognized their practicality and uniqueness. Unlike some cars that were scrapped as soon as they wore out, Rancheros often stayed in use, patched up, and repurposed for decades. In the bigger picture, the Ranchero paved the way for other car-truck hybrids, most famously the Chevrolet El Camino, which arrived 2 years later. While the El Camino often stole the spotlight, the Ranchero remained steady and consistent, proving itself as a long-lived and practical machine. So, while the Ford Ranchero may have seemed like an oddball in the showroom, its blend of sedan comfort, truck utility, and proven durability made it a vehicle that could last far beyond expectations. It's a testament to Ford's strategy of building something new without reinventing the wheel, literally using what already worked.
Number 7. When Chevrolet introduced the El Camino in 1959, it wasn't just a styling experiment. It was a direct answer to Ford's Ranchero, which had arrived 2 years earlier. The idea was simple: give buyers the comfort and drivability of a passenger car, but with the utility of a pickup truck. What Chevrolet did right was in the engineering. The El Camino borrowed the rugged underpinnings of Chevy's full-size sedans, meaning that beneath its flashy sheet metal was the same proven hardware that millions of Americans were already relying on. The first-generation El Camino, 1959 to 1960, was based on the Chevrolet Brookwood wagon platform, so it wasn't fragile or underbuilt. These early models carried the same straight-six and small-block V8 engines as the sedans, which were already known for their durability. Farmers, small business owners, and tradesmen discovered that the El Camino could haul loads during the day, then clean up nicely for a night out, something a traditional pickup truck couldn't quite match in that era. After a brief hiatus, Chevrolet revived the El Camino in 1964, this time built on the intermediate Chevelle platform. This was a turning point. Not only did the El Camino inherit the ruggedness of the Chevelle chassis, but it also gained access to Chevrolet's entire muscle car powertrain lineup. Buyers could order anything from an economical inline-six all the way up to the monstrous 454 cubic inch big block V8. Even when people used them hard, hauling lumber, towing trailers, or hot rodding down the street, the engines and drivetrains proved incredibly resilient. By the 1970s, as emissions regulations and fuel crises slowed down performance cars, the El Camino's reputation for toughness only grew. Owners realized that these weren't just novelty vehicles, they were workhorses that could rack up 200,000 miles with proper care. Mechanics loved them too. Because they were essentially Chevelles or Monte Carlos with a bed on the back, parts were cheap and easy to source. Even after decades of hauling gravel, hay bales, or tools, many El Caminos could still be patched up and driven daily. The final generation, running into the late 1980s, may not have had the same muscle as its 1960s and early 70s predecessors, but it retained the same formula: durable engines, simple body-on-frame construction, and a dual-purpose personality. Whether owned by a tradesman, a hot rodder, or even suburban families who wanted something different, the El Camino became a cultural icon. Its longevity is evident in how many are still on the road today, often restored or modified, but still standing as proof of Chevrolet's commitment to durable design. So what makes the El Camino legendary isn't just that it blended car and truck, it's that it lasted. Through hard work, abuse, and changing trends, these machines earned a reputation for surviving decades of use. They weren't always glamorous, but in terms of toughness and versatility, the El Camino more than held its own against the Ranchero and in many ways outlived it in spirit.
Number 6. When we talk about the Oldsmobile Cutlass, we're not just talking about one model. We're really talking about a car that evolved into one of the best-selling names in American automotive history. From its debut in 1961 as a compact car all the way into the 1980s, the Cutlass carved out a reputation for being both stylish and reliable, while at the same time incredibly durable. In the 1960s, the Cutlass began life as part of GM's compact F85 line. It wasn't flashy at first, but Oldsmobile saw an opportunity. Americans were beginning to look for cars that were a bit smaller and more practical than the massive full-size sedans of the 1950s. By giving the Cutlass clean styling and reliable engineering, Oldsmobile put itself in a perfect position to grow with the market. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Cutlass nameplate had expanded into a full range of mid-size cars: coupes, sedans, convertibles, and station wagons. This was the golden age for the Cutlass. Models like the Cutlass Supreme hit the sweet spot for American buyers. They worked as bare bones as economy cars, but they weren't as expensive as Cadillacs or Buicks either. The Cutlass gave you luxury appointments at a price working families could afford, and that's a big reason it became so popular. Mechanically, the Cutlass was powered by Oldsmobile's small-block V8s, engines like the Rocket 350. These engines developed a reputation for being practically unkillable. Owners would drive them for 100,000, 150,000, even 200,000 miles with little more than oil changes and routine maintenance. Mechanics used to say that a Cutlass engine would still be running long after the rest of the car had rusted away. This toughness meant that Cutlasses could survive everything, from family road trips to high school drag races to decades of commuter duty. By the mid to late 1970s, the Cutlass had become America's best-selling car. In fact, in 1976 and again in 1977, the Cutlass Supreme topped the sales charts, something that very few models can claim. It seemed like every street corner had one, and almost every American family either owned one or knew someone who did. Even in the 1980s, when downsizing and front-wheel drive platforms began to reshape the car market, the Cutlass name stayed strong. Whether it was on the Cutlass Sierra or the Cutlass Supreme, the name carried with it the weight of 2 decades of trust. People bought Cutlasses because they knew what they were getting: a car that looked good, was comfortable to drive, and, most importantly, would last. So, when we reflect on the Oldsmobile Cutlass, we see more than just a car. We see an icon of American streets, a car that managed to balance style, affordability, and sheer toughness in a way that made it a household name. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. And that's exactly why, decades later, people still remember the Cutlass as one of the best cars Oldsmobile ever built. Number 5. If we're going to talk about one of Dodge's most rugged and dependable big cars, we can't ignore the Polara, produced from 1960 through 1973. At first glance, it was just another full-sized family sedan, but in reality, the Polara was one of Dodge's most resilient workhorses, a car that not only survived but thrived in some of the harshest conditions possible: police duty.
When Dodge launched the Polara in 1960, it rode on Chrysler's B-body platform before later moving to the larger C-body. Underneath its stylish, often flamboyant sheet metal of the early 1960s was Chrysler engineering at its core. Strong unibody construction, stout torsion bar suspension, and a choice of rock-solid V8 engines. These weren't fragile cars built for looks alone, they were built to withstand heavy use and to deliver consistent performance day after day. One of the biggest factors that made the Polara so tough was its drivetrain lineup. Buyers could equip it with Chrysler's durable Slant 6 in lower trims, or more commonly, a range of V8s, from the reliable 318 small block to the heavy-hitting 383, 440, and even the legendary 426 Max Wedge in performance variants. Paired with Chrysler's bulletproof TorqueFlite automatic transmission, these engines were known to rack up hundreds of thousands of miles with only routine maintenance. Fleet managers loved them because they just didn't quit. And this brings us to one of the most important roles the Polara played in American life: police service. Throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, Dodge sold thousands of Polaras to law enforcement agencies across the United States. Police departments needed vehicles that could take a beating: long hours idling, high-speed pursuits, hard braking, and constant stop-and-go use. Most cars simply wore out too quickly. The Polara, with its robust V8 engines and heavy-duty suspension and brakes, proved it could endure. In fact, by the late 1960s, Dodge Polaras were among the most common squad cars on American roads. Officers trusted them because they were fast, tough, and reliable. Beyond police fleets, everyday families also benefited from that durability. Owners often recall Polaras lasting 150,000 to 200,000 miles at a time when most cars were lucky to survive 100,000. The interiors were simple and functional, the mechanical parts were easy to service, and Chrysler engineering gave the Polara a reputation for being overbuilt compared to some of its competitors. By the early 1970s, Dodge was refreshing its lineup, and the Polara was eventually phased out in favor of the Monaco and other models. But its legacy remained clear. This was a car that could take punishment and keep going. Whether serving as the backbone of American police forces or as a durable family hauler, Dodge proved Dodge could build a big car with staying power.
Number 4. The Pontiac Tempest, which was produced between 1961 and 1970. It is an excellent example of how an American automaker experimented with innovation, but then quickly learned the value of rugged dependability. The Tempest began life in 1961 as part of General Motors' new wave of senior compacts, designed to slot between the tiny Corvair and the larger full-size cars. Pontiac wanted something fresh and different, and so the first-generation Tempest was a very unusual car for Detroit standards. Underneath, it carried a rear-mounted transaxle linked to the front-mounted engine by a flexible drive shaft nicknamed the rope drive. The suspension was fully independent, another radical move in a decade dominated by solid rear axles. Buyers could even get a 4-cylinder engine derived from slicing Pontiac's big V8 in half, or an aluminum 215 V8 borrowed from Buick. Now, in theory, all this sounded exciting. It was advanced, innovative, and gave the Tempest a light, nimble driving feel that was unlike most American cars of the time. In fact, the 1961 Tempest was even named Motor Trend's Car of the Year. But in practice, some of that innovation came at a cost. The rope drive shaft and rear transaxle were complex, and the half-a-V8 4-cylinder engine was rough and unrefined. Over time, these early Tempests proved more difficult to maintain than Pontiac's larger, simpler cars. By the mid-1960s, Pontiac decided to change course. Starting in 1964, the Tempest was redesigned as a more conventional mid-size car. It shared GM's new A-body platform with the Chevrolet Chevelle, Oldsmobile Cutlass, and Buick Skylark. Out went the quirky rope drive and rear transaxle, and in came tried-and-true front-engine, rear-wheel drive layouts with solid rear axles and rugged small-block V8s. This decision transformed the Tempest into a dependable, durable car that families could trust. It was also in this era that the Tempest became historically significant. In 1964, Pontiac took the Tempest platform and gave it a bigger V8, birthing the legendary Pontiac GTO, the car widely credited with starting the muscle car era.
So even though the GTO outshined the Tempest in the public eye, it was the Tempest's dependable bones that made that performance revolution possible. Throughout the late 1960s, the Tempest continued to be a steady seller. Customers liked that it was affordable, reliable, and easy to maintain. GM's rugged drivetrain components, particularly Pontiac's small block V8s, were known to last well past 100,000 miles with only routine maintenance. Police forces, taxi fleets, and budget-conscious families all found value in the Tempest. By the 1970 model year, Pontiac began phasing out the Tempest name, folding it into the broader Le Mans lineup. Yet the reputation remained. Once it dropped its early quirks, the Tempest earned respect as a tough, honest, mid-size car that could withstand years of hard driving. So, to sum it up, the Pontiac Tempest is remembered in two ways. On the one hand, it was a bold experiment that showed Pontiac's willingness to innovate with the rope drive transaxle system. On the other hand, it became a symbol of GM's rugged and practical engineering once it settled into the A-body midsize formula.
Number 3. When we think of budget cars of the 1970s, most people immediately picture stripped-down, flimsy compacts that were bought cheaply and discarded just as quickly. But the Ford Maverick was different. It may not have been glamorous, but it was one of those cars that simply refused to die, thanks to Ford's decision to build it with simple, proven components that had already stood the test of time. The Maverick debuted in April of 1969 as a 1970 model, at the height of America's response to the import invasion. Volkswagen Beetles, Toyota Corollas, and Datsun 510s were winning over budget-minded buyers, and Ford needed a low-cost car to fight back. The Maverick was introduced at a rock-bottom price of just under $2,000, advertised heavily as the import fighter. And while it didn't offer European sophistication or Japanese efficiency, it had something those cars didn't: Ford's rock-solid, straight-six engines. At the heart of the Maverick's toughness was the 144, 170, and later the 200 and 250 cubic-inch inline-six engines. These were the same simple six cylinders that had been powering Ford Falcons and base Mustangs for years. They were known for being nearly indestructible. They could take abuse, run on poor fuel, tolerate neglect, and still keep starting every morning. As the Maverick matured, Ford also offered its small block V8s, the 302 cubic-inch V8 in particular, which added more performance without sacrificing reliability. In either case, whether a thrifty 6 or a lively V8, the Maverick had drivetrains that were about as close to bulletproof as a 1970s economy car could get. But what really gave the Maverick its reputation as a just-keep-running car was its simplicity. It was built on straightforward unibody construction, with mechanical parts borrowed from the Falcon and Mustang, meaning repairs were cheap and easy. There was no complex engineering, no cutting-edge features to break, just a basic car that worked. Even the styling was modest but practical, a two-door fastback-like shape that looked sportier than it really was, helping it appeal to younger buyers. Over time, the Maverick became the car of the everyman. In its prime, it was a bestseller, moving more than 500,000 units in its first year alone. But its real life came in the used car market. By the mid to late 1970s, you could buy a second-hand Maverick for just a few $100s. College kids, young families, and working-class drivers bought them as cheap beaters, and the cars just kept on going. Stories abound of Mavericks running well past 150,000 or even 200,000 miles, impressive numbers for that era, with little more than basic maintenance. Police fleets didn't use Mavericks, nor did they become muscle car legends. But what they did become was part of America's everyday landscape. For nearly a decade, they were everywhere, in driveways, on farms, parked at schools and factories. The Maverick may not have been glamorous, but it earned the trust of countless Americans who needed reliable, affordable transportation. In the end, the Ford Maverick is remembered as a survivor. Not flashy, not revolutionary, but dependable in a way that gave it a quiet legacy.
It proved that even a budget car, if kept simple and fitted with proven engines, could be built to last.
Number 2. When we look back at American cars of the 1980s, the Chevrolet Celebrity doesn't usually grab headlines. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't particularly fast, and it never became a collector's darling. Yet it quietly became one of the most dependable commuter cars of its era. The kind of car that got people to work, to the grocery store, and back home without drama. In fact, its boring nature was exactly what made it successful. The Celebrity was built on GM's A-body platform, a front-wheel drive architecture that it shared with the Buick Century, Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, and Pontiac 6000. These cars were designed during a transitional moment for GM when efficiency and practicality were finally taking priority over excess chrome and massive V8s of the 1970s. The Celebrity fit that mold perfectly. It was offered as a sedan, coupe, and wagon, appealing to families, commuters, and even some fleet buyers like rental companies and local government fleets. What made the Celebrity stand out wasn't cutting-edge technology. It was the exact opposite. GM deliberately built it simple and rugged, using components that were easy to service, easy to understand, and proven across multiple divisions. Under the hood, you'd most often find the 2.8 or later 3.1-liter V6, engines that may not have been powerful but were incredibly durable. These motors could run for 200,000 miles or more with basic maintenance. Even the base 4-cylinder option, while underpowered, was simple and economical. The Celebrity's front-wheel drive layout gave it better traction in bad weather compared to older rear-drive sedans, which mattered in snowy regions of the Midwest and Northeast. Combine that with good ride comfort from GM suspension tuning, and you had a car that wasn't exciting but was incredibly usable. Another key factor was low cost of ownership. Parts were cheap and plentiful since the Celebrity shared so many components with other GM A-body cars. Local mechanics knew how to fix them, and owners often kept them for decades because they just refused to quit. Now, let's not romanticize too much. The Celebrity had its flaws. The styling was generic, bordering on invisible, and the interior plastics were prone to cracking with age. The transmission, particularly the early 3-speed automatics, could be a weak spot if neglected. And when compared to imports like the Toyota Camry or Honda Accord of the 1980s, the Celebrity didn't match their refinement or resale value. Yet, in its prime, the Chevrolet Celebrity was America's best-selling car in 1986, which speaks volumes about its appeal to the average driver. It wasn't a car people dreamed of, it was a car people trusted. In hindsight, the Celebrity perfectly represents 1980s middle-class transportation, dependable, unpretentious, and built to quietly survive. It may never be a show car at a classic auction, but for the families who owned them, it was a machine that delivered exactly what it promised: reliable mobility year after year.
Number 1. If we step back to the 1970s, we find Buick in an interesting position. The brand had built its reputation as the bridge between Chevrolet's affordability and Cadillac's luxury. It was the doctor's car, as people used to say. Practical, respectable, but still carrying a little prestige. In 1973, Buick introduced the Regal, a personal luxury coupe built on GM's intermediate platform. Now, what's important here is that while the Regal was marketed as stylish and comfortable, it also turned out to be a mechanical survivor. The Regal's strength came from what was under the hood. At launch, it was offered with a range of Buick V8 engines, everything from the modest 350 to the big 455. These engines were overbuilt, designed during an era when reliability mattered more than squeezing out every last bit of efficiency. They were smooth, torquey, and most importantly, they had an incredible tolerance for abuse. Owners could drive them hard, neglect oil changes, and still expect them to keep running. By the mid-1970s, the oil crisis forced Buick to rethink its approach. This is when the Regal became one of the first cars to champion the Buick V6. Initially, this engine was developed to save fuel, but it turned out to be one of the most rugged and long-lasting motors GM ever built. Mechanics who worked on them in the 1970s and 80s will tell you, the 231 cubic inch Buick V6, later the 3.8-liter, could take hundreds of thousands of miles if maintained even moderately well. And crucially, it was simple. No exotic components, no complicated electronics in the early years, just straightforward American engineering. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of the Regal's legacy is how it straddled both ordinary family duty and performance history. On the family side, the Regal sedan and coupe became a common sight in suburban driveways. It was the kind of car you could hand down from father to son. The bench seats held up well, the bodies didn't rust as quickly as some Chevrolets of the same era, and the engines just kept pulling. A Buick Regal with 100,000 miles on the odometer wasn't worn out, it was just getting broken in. But then there's the performance twist. In the 1980s, Buick took that same V6 and bolted on a turbocharger. Models like the Regal T-Type and, most famously, the Grand National proved that reliability and performance weren't mutually exclusive. A turbocharged Regal could outrun Corvettes and Camaros, but if maintained properly, it would still last. This is rare in performance cars, which usually sacrifice durability for speed. The Regal showed that GM engineering, at least in this era, could achieve both. From 1973 through the late 1980s, the Regal carved out a reputation as a car that just didn't quit. Whether you had the simple V6 in your family sedan or the high-powered Grand National tearing up drag strips, the core engineering was bulletproof. Today, collectors love the sporty turbocharged models, but even the plain beige Regals of the 1970s and 80s are remembered as dependable, easy-to-maintain machines. They were built during a time when cars were still mechanical first, electronic second. And that simplicity is why many are still on the road decades later. In short, the Buick Regal may not have been the flashiest American car of its time, but it earned respect. Respect because it delivered what most people really needed. A car that would start every morning, run for years, and quietly build a legacy of dependability.